There's a certain respect that comes from size. And I'm not just talking about scale. I don't mean the size of the pyramids or the amount of people in a city. I'm talking about presence. It's a force that demands attention or can shape behavior. It's something we immediately recognize and are constantly drawn to. Whether it's a colossal tower or a powerful idea, it's almost as if we're wired for the magnitude of things. In nature, size often equates to strength. The biggest animals have the fewest predators. Human society is no different. A grand monument inspires awe, while a single leader can sway the minds of millions. Ultimately, size is something that affects us on every level, from how we perceive others to how we measure success. Due to this, the psychology of scale isn't just about what's large, it's about how largeness in all its forms shapes our lives. But if there was one area that demonstrates the power that size has, it would be megalophobia. Megalophobia is the intense fear of large objects. And while most of us are stricken by awe when encountering something massive, there's a small subset of the population, specifically 8.7%, who are struck by a deep fear. Why this is the case is kind of a mystery. I mean, sure, we evolved to have a bias toward threats, and something large is obviously more threatening than something small. But this only applies to living, breathing things. Yet when surfing through the Cleveland Clinic directory, megalophobia seems to be a fear primarily directed at structures. I have a few theories about this. Maybe it points towards something existential, as nothing is a better example of our insignificance than being in the presence of something that could squash you like a bug. Or perhaps it's because of its pervasive nature, as even from an ecological perspective, size impacts everything from anatomy and growth rate to habitat use and lifespan. Regardless, it's clear that size is not just a physical phenomenon, but rather a psychological one as well. For me at least, large things, be it structures, vehicles, or creatures, come with a certain level of fascination. I don't feel fear towards them, but instead a feeling of awe. Awe in neuroscience literature is an emotion that people feel when they encounter something vast or something powerful, but only if it's so overwhelming that it challenges our current understanding of the world. As the theory goes, when people feel awe, they often behave in ways that support the interests of a larger group. This probably explains why civilizations like those of the ancient Egyptians made the pyramids as big as they did. Whether intentional or not, they tapped into a deep psychological principle, using awe to unify their people. This works for two reasons. First, awe causes changes in our physiology. The feeling not only triggers the release of oxytocin, the hormone of bonding, but also induces a parasympathetic response, which calms down the body. But more importantly, immense size has been shown to reduce the focus we have on ourselves, instead causing us to shift our focus to that which is around us. Both of these, together, work in tandem to induce pro-social behavior, producing a desire that makes one want to be part of something greater. Still, for this to work, the size has to be seen in a way that produces awe, not in a way that can be seen as threatening, which is difficult because the most common response to size is the sublime. The term sublime refers to experiences that are both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It is the state you feel when looking into a vast abyss, where the beauty of the landscape might take your breath away, but the immense drop below sends a tinge of dread down your spine. Large structures are known to evoke this feeling, and I think it's because of the potential large things have for harm. A massive hurricane or a large earthquake is obviously going to cause a lot more destruction than a smaller version of each. On top of that, large structures are kind of ambiguous. They have both this familiar and alien-like quality. I think the best example of this is the large human figurines on Easter Island. Imagine being an explorer in the 1700s and then stumbling upon these structures. There would definitely be a feeling of intrigue and probably familiarity because they are humans after all. But the scale makes them overwhelming, the distorted shape makes them slightly uncomfortable, and of course the question of what could have made them at this time would send a shiver down my spine. An interesting note about neuroscience studies on the feeling of the sublime is that even though the state is in part characterized by fear, fMRI studies don't pick up on any signals of fear in the brain. Normally, when something is perceived as threatening, both the amygdala and insula are activated, which then trigger action through the fight or flight system. But specifically in the case of the sublime, no brain activity in the amygdala or insula takes place, which means even though the state has an element of fear, it's not actually fear, or at the very least, not the traditional version of it that we're used to. Size is also associated with power. I think the Titanic is probably the best example of this. Created in response to the growing demand for luxurious travel, its immense size was used as a primary signal to display its prestige. And I think, because I'm speculating here, that this might explain the findings of those studies on the Sublime. Power has a tendency to tilt toward corruption. For this reason, it's wise to be cautious of anything or anyone with too much power. But power itself isn't inherently fear-provoking. And what I mean by that is, it doesn't inspire the same fear as being chased down a dark alleyway or by being startled by something. Instead, it's more of a contemplative response, one that comes from the recognition of something being beyond our control. And so, any encounter with size, whether artificial or natural, is not just a reaction to the sheer physical scale, but also to what the scale represents. Through this lens, the variation in fear that the Sublime creates is not because we fear the object itself, but because we sense the inherent risks, the downfall such an immense power would create. And the outcome of the Titanic kind of outlines this idea. The very thing that made it awe-inspiring is also what made its demise so devastating. One of the things that can unite people on either side of the political spectrum is that both sides hate gigantism. I mean, people on the right hate mega governments and people on the left hate mega corporations. It seems like the one thing they have in common is an adverse reaction to size. Almost like there's an instinctual reaction to anything that feels too large to be held accountable or too powerful to be held in check. This shared reaction, despite how clannish everything else associated with politics tends to be, is really interesting to me because across many fields, scientists, visionaries, and thinkers have touched on the concept of a cumulative advantage, which is when a small win makes it more likely to have larger wins over time. In business, the best example of this is the network effect, which states that the value of a service or product increases as more people use it. In, I think it's economics, Vilfredo Pareto describes something called the Pareto principle, which is an observation describing a pattern where roughly 80% of results come from 20% of causes. And in theology, the Matthew principle states something along the lines of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. All of these principles come from very different areas, but are all observations of essentially the same idea, the disproportionate effect of size. Whether in user-based influence or wealth, large entities once established tend to grow even larger, while smaller entities find it increasingly difficult to compete. This trend creates a cycle where big players can then reinforce their dominance to get even bigger. What's interesting to me about this is how different the reaction is in this context compared to the one I brought up earlier about the pyramids. And I think it's because while the pyramids were originally tied to an individual's legacy of power, over time they evolved into symbols of the extraordinary, what a unified civilization can achieve when they work together. In contrast, mega governments or corporations often represent a concentration of power that feels distant. Their size doesn't inspire a sense of collective pride, but rather an unease, a reminder of the gap in power between different groups of people. Still, this alone seems kind of incomplete as an explanation. I mean, sure, a constant reminder of something having more than you can breed resentment. But there are lots of examples of rulers or people who, despite having more influence than everybody else, still draw admiration even to this day. And so, I think another element that factors in here is how pervasive something is. Megalophobia is a popular topic on YouTube. And while it's most primarily discussed through the lens of one gigantic thing, size can apply to the sheer quantity of things as well. Imagine, for example, being trapped in a room where you're surrounded by thousands of extremely repetitive objects. Just the endless number, regardless of size, would create an unnatural uniformity, almost like each identical piece is stripping away at your individuality. Sure, it's not exactly the same feeling that's inspired by scale, but it's similar. Antechamber by Alexander Bruce is the best example I can think of to represent this. The game has a suffocating atmosphere, and that's because the rooms you move through are just repeating designs that loop endlessly. The game's use of non-Euclidean spaces, where rooms can lead back into themselves or repeat in very peculiar ways, is what creates this overwhelming feeling. If I were to think about it, and then describe what it means to be overwhelmed, I would probably define it as being bombarded by an endless stream of information. Some of that information will be positive, while other parts of it will feel negative. But in the end, it leads to the same thing, a weight that builds up until you get a feeling that your circumstances are inescapable. This ubiquitous feeling is what quantity and size have in common, a subtle sense that something can infiltrate everything. And the Pareto principle that I brought up earlier seems to suggest this very thing. If 80% of results come from 20% of what you do, it means that 20% is much more connected or powerful compared to everything else. In other words, it's an example of how pervasive size can be. I know I'm jumping around a lot, but I think another example that can illustrate this point more clearly is a locust swarm. An individual locust by itself is not particularly terrifying. I mean, it's not like it can harm you. But a locust swarm is an entirely different animal. Suddenly, something small that was not particularly threatening has the capability of destroying everything when it swarms with others. Just look at some of the videos depicting the aftermath of a locust swarm. It's actually terrifying. The swarm darkens the sky, the sheer amount blurs your vision, and the barren landscape that remains is stripped to its core. They spread everywhere and into everything, creating a feeling of helplessness, like you literally cannot do anything to stop it. This is where I think the true fear of large things comes from, the ability of something too big to affect everything else. Be it a giant structure that can crush you like a bug, a person with so much power that they can influence everything around them, or a swarm whose sheer numbers make it impossible to combat. At its core, the fear of size comes from its influence, the ability it has to shape its landscape, making us powerless in response. Of course, for me to make this claim, there's one last area I want to touch on, perhaps the most pervasive version of size that can ever exist: the size of ideas. While never explicitly stated, one of the things I've noticed about every iteration of the Joker is how it's always hinted that the Joker isn't a single person, but instead an idea. Because of that, he can never be defeated, as even if this iteration falls, another one will rise up to take its place. Ideas are forever in a way. They can start small but spread quickly. They can take on a life of their own and don't require the person who came up with them to be alive. But the most terrifying thing about ideas, especially powerful ones, is that they can grow beyond anyone's control. At this point, I'm convinced that the fear people have towards size stems from the influence it represents, from the ability it has to spread into or shape everything around it. Ideas are the ultimate form of this. A single one can shape a city, sway a nation, or change the world. Of course, this doesn't always mean it's for the better. Jung once stated, "People don't have ideas, ideas have people." And what he meant by that was, ideas possess the unique ability to take hold of people. When gripped by one, it's almost as if a force is living through us as opposed to coming from us. And I think this is why, when an idea is challenged, it feels like a personal attack. The reality is, there's so many different variables that shape what we believe or how we behave. Culture, experience, genetics, and all the ideas we've absorbed along the way. Because of that, it can become difficult to tell where something originates. Does it come from us or from something else? This is what I mean by the size of an idea so large that it permeates and influences every aspect of our lives, that it can spread into and infect large groups of people, popping up again and again throughout time, pushing the same vision or agenda. In Batman movies, the Joker's persona is an idea that operates on this scale. It's intangible, persistent, and doesn't take up any space. It can reshape the things around it and does so repeatedly, never truly able to be defeated. Eventually, when an idea becomes large enough, it becomes an action, and when it does, whether it's for better or for worse is impossible to predict. Up until this point, I've primarily focused on the negative aspects of size, and that's because this video is about megalophobia after all. But it's important to note that something large has just as much of a capacity for immense good as it does for immense evil, and in an odd way, I think insignificance highlights this. Another common feeling generated by anything large is the feeling of being insignificant, but not in a bad way, not in a way that makes you feel like you're not valued. More so, in a way that makes one realize how small their concerns feel in the grand scheme of things. Keltner and Haidt proposed the idea that awe fosters a sense of a small self. Since then, it's sparked a surge of research, which has revealed that large structures not only do create this sense, but also that the feeling of insignificance derived from these situations is more closely linked to humility than to any other emotion. If there was one thing you could do right now that would start improving your life, it would be practicing humility. Not only does it enhance pro-social behavior and improve mental health outcomes, but it also has a drastic effect on how we view ourselves, which again is why past civilizations put so much effort into creating vast structures. The benefit of this insignificance is that it creates a type of social glue. If you're standing in front of some vast, overpowering object, like, say, space, it will naturally encourage you to think less about yourself and, by definition, more about everything else around you. So if some civilization follows this trajectory and puts up a large symbol of its collective power, it would naturally help foster a larger group identity, as by pulling focus away from the individual, the attention would then be redirected to what the symbol represents. Even though it's not really related to what I'm saying, I think the art drawn in Blame does a good job of showcasing this. The artwork is the literal embodiment of a picture is worth 1,000 words, and the story is incredibly lacking in dialogue. You can often go pages without seeing a single word. But that's what this story does so well. The narrative is not actually about what happens, but instead about the scenery. The most captivating drawings are of sprawling staircases or massive landscapes, things that evoke emotion, generally through scale. Because of that, his drawings make the protagonist feel like he's not the main character, and instead used as a camera to portray the real story, the setting. Not all large awe-inducing experiences are tied to group interests. But if there was one thing that I could say has the potential to unite people more than anything else, it would be large threats. A huge hurricane or a large-scale attack on a country brings people together way more than we'd like to admit. So much so that it's become a cliche in stories. The enemy of my enemy is my friend and all that. And so the feeling we get from things that are huge might be way more beneficial than we realize, and may one day help blur the lines that divide us today. Either way, it seems like the impact of scale is much larger than we think it is. Until next time, cheers.